wouldn't say I'm a massive fan of Hodinkee limited edition releases. I mean, when they first came out, I was really excited. I was like, oh, hey, wow, that's cool. Watch nerds are getting to help design some watches now. And now it's kind of feels like a money grab. You know, they just say, hey, here's a limited edition. And I'm sure they cut the money and, you know, it's several $100,000 in revenue that somehow gets split, that everyone makes money, and that's fine. And sometimes there are good versions, and so it makes sense. This is one of those examples where I think it's actually a version that makes sense, at least this specific colorway. The watch we're talking about is the Autodromo. This is the H1, so this is the green dial variant, or mint, or whatever. I don't know what specific marketing term they're using to call this green dial. But the reason why I picked it up is frankly because I thought when I swapped off the original bracelet that it would be a really cool looking piece, not to mention the fact that for a manual wind Sellita caliber chronograph, it seemed like a pretty good package with a sleek or unique looking dial face. And so that was kind of why when it came out, you know, I thought about it for a couple hours and then I bought it, and now that colorway is sold out. They did 100 per color. So there's only 100 of these. You can see the number on this as I'm unboxing it. And the watch itself is, you know, it's pretty nice, I have to be honest with you. Now there are some things I don't like. I'll definitely go through those at the end of the video and whether or not it's worth the price tag that they're paying for the limited edition version. But I want to walk through some of the things I really like about it and my initial impressions when I unboxed it. So the first thing I thought when I unboxed it was that I really did not like the bracelet it came on. I understood the aesthetic that they were going for. It was very 70s, it was very retro, and that all kind of made sense. It was an integrated bracelet, you know, all that's fine. The problem is that there's not a whole lot of differentiation in the finishing on that bracelet as it articulates or as it moves. And so what it ended up looking like is kind of just a flat brushed steel bracelet all the way around with some minor separation where you could tell one link ended and the next one started. Even the Tissot PRX, I thought that bracelet did a really, really nice job of differentiating the finishing from one to the next by typically doing chamfers or polishes at the edges of every single link. What that allows it to do is that as it articulates, those polishes catch the light, and so you can see a further separation between each of the links in the bracelet, and so it looks a lot nicer. Either way, the point is I swapped it onto this taupe leather strap, and I immediately loved it. You know, I thought, okay, this is what it should have been on in the first place, at least in terms of how I like my designs on my watches and on my wrist. Now, I'm not typically a colored dial person. If you watch this channel, you'll see that I'm almost always black dials, sterile things, you know, very boring things. And so this was definitely something that was unique. This Group B has a 40 millimeter diameter. It's, I think, a little over 13.5 millimeters thick. You can see these specs on the screen right now. It's got a really common 20 millimeter lug width, although the lugs are hidden lugs, or they're tucked underneath the case, so to speak. And it's powered by a Sellita SW510, which is essentially Sellita's version of the Valjoux 7750 with the rotor pulled off. Everything else about it, from what I could tell, look exactly the same. And I would know, I've disassembled and put back together a Valjoux 7750, I think about 3 times now. So I know generally what parts in the architecture and the layout of the movement, and that's exactly what this looks like with the rotor pulled off. And there's some advantages to that, frankly. Obviously, everyone knows that the 7750 is a very reliable movement, and the main reason behind that is actually the way that it works. So typically a chronograph has a big wheel here and a big wheel here. This one's always spinning and this one's waiting. And then what it does is it basically pulls this wheel in as a bridge to the chronograph wheel. And then once this hits, it starts spinning the main chronograph wheel, and all that makes sense. What the Valjoux 7750 does is it actually uses an oscillating pinion. So imagine basically a rod that's always rotating at the bottom from a gear in the bottom that's rotating it. So it's always spinning, it's really skinny, and then basically what the lever does is pull it towards the main chronograph wheel and therefore moving it. And what that ends up with is less binding, less basically friction on that part, and so it wears a lot better over time. Typically, that bridge, that wheel that has to swing in and bridge between them, has to have really sharp teeth because it has to jump in and find a divot to kind of meet, go in, and then allow it to move. So it has to couple effectively very quickly, and so they end up making really sharp teeth as opposed to a more chamfered tooth, which is what you see on most watchmaking. I'm going into specifics. The point is, it's a really rugged way of doing chronographs. It doesn't display well. It doesn't look nice from a top view, which is why most people don't use it. But it ends up aging quite well in terms of the chronograph mechanism and the pinion itself. Now that's really nerdy, but the point is that the watch itself is pretty decent. You know, I like it a lot for what it's offering. I know that it's gonna last for a decent amount of time. I know the way that it's basically built and how everything works. And I also know that I like this dial. I think it has a really unique flavor about it. It definitely looks a lot more like a driver's watch in the fact that the entire bottom portion, I would say the bottom 3/4 of the dial, are recessed in a different shade of green, and so it looks almost like the display on a car where you can see all those different wheels. This particular version is all stainless steel that's been brushed, and then they put a hardened coating on that stainless steel. It has obviously that green dial, and it's loomed like crazy. Now that being said, this loom does not last very well. You can see in this loom shot here exactly what is loomed versus what is not, and what you'll end up finding if you wear this for any extended period of time is that the loom doesn't really matter. You can't see it come a couple hours later, at least I couldn't. I baked this thing in UV with a flashlight, and then I tried to wear it about 3 hours later at night, and it was dark. I mean, it was pitch dark. And what I'm not used to is most of my watches have lume, and so it was weird to look at my wrist and actually not be able to see the time at all. So that was something that you should know. Don't expect a great thing on lume. So aside from the design aesthetic of it, the fact that it should, in theory, hold its value, at least in the short term, assuming that people remain interested in both Autodromo and Hodinkee and this specific release, depending on how many limited editions that they do, all that kind of will tell you whether or not it will retain its value. The watch itself is a good value, even if it doesn't. Even if you're just looking for a driving style chronograph that's manually wound with a reliable movement that has an interesting modern driving aesthetic, this is your watch. I mean, at least this is one of the strong contenders. This is something that I personally really liked and stood out to me and I really enjoyed. I think that the darker stainless steel with that treatment really matches the green or the mint really well. I thought that the color variations they did on the dial are beautiful. I think that the pusher action's great, the crown action's great, the feeling of the watch is fantastic. The proportions are perfect in a 40mm that's got a really compact lug to lug. You know, I have honestly very few, if any, complaints about the watch on those basics, on the things you typically buy and continue to wear a watch for. I'll still nitpick though. There are still a few things. One of those is going to be the lume. Now again, I'm not expecting the world in terms of lume, but you know, obviously it's a disappointment still. The other thing I would have tweaked is the bezel itself. I understood that they were going for this brushed, bead blasted, you know, aesthetic, but I think that the bezel was an opportunity to have a little bit more depth to it, layer it in some way. If they did bead blasted or brushed with a polish or kind of changed up the finishings between these different ledges on the bezel, I think would have helped it pop a little more. As it sits right now, the bezel just seems kind of, because it's so matte, it just seems kind of slapped on. And physically there, but not necessarily like it's taking any visual presence on the dial. And lastly, the only other thing I would say is that it's obviously disappointing that there was really only one colorway that I was interested in. I know there are 5 and some people like one over the other, but I think of all of them, because most of them had bicolor between the tachometer and the actual font itself, they were kind of swapping colors for an accent. I think it looked a little strange, a little too much, but you know, that's just me. I like keeping everything a similar tone or a similar color palette. And then the last complaint would just be the bracelet. I mean, there's a reason why I took it off. I wish that they had taken a little extra time in just chamfering around the edges. Now, granted, that might be really expensive. I don't actually know if that's prohibitively expensive for them to do that. I understood the aesthetic that they were going for was supposed to look very 70s, like futuristic style, where there weren't polishes in between, but I think it's a step above that makes the bracelet a little bit more wearable. While the butterfly clasp on it is a nice touch, I think the bracelet is too uniform with the watch itself. There's no separation at all between the two, and no separation between the links, and so it all kind of blurs, and I did not find that very attractive. So that's the only thing. The last gripe I would say would just be the fact that because these are hidden lugs, it is a pain to actually get a strap in there. The lug itself, or the lug hole, is so close to the case that you really have to jam or push the strap forward to try and get that spring bar pin to actually fire into the lug hole. So just keep that in mind. It takes a little bit of work to actually get a strap on there, but once you do, I think you would be happy with it. So let me know what you guys think. Do you hate all limited edition Hodinkee watches? Do me a favor and subscribe. I bought this. I buy a lot of these watches because I like talking about them. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.